South Africa and another 25 African countries are moving closer to finalizing the Tripartite Free Trade Area agreement. This deal integrates three existing trading blocs. These are the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, the Southern African Development Community, and the Eastern African Community. Joining us is Director at Political Economy Southern Africa, Sia Beniza. Well, Sia, just tell us more about the Free Trade Agreement and what it means for trade on the continent.
Sure. So the Free Trade Agreement is a consolidation of three trading blocs on the continent. As you mentioned, EAC, COMESA, and SADC. What this means is that countries are now making some consolidated or some concerted effort towards consolidating regional trade on the continent. So in as much as the continent is well integrated with the international economy, there seems to be some bottlenecks within on the continent intra-regional trade. So the Tripartite Free Trade Area is a step towards consolidating as well as diversifying the trade amongst African countries on the continent.
There's been a drive for to have intra-African trade every time there is a meeting, whether it be at SADC or the World Bank, but it never seems to happen. So how have they sorted out the bottlenecks and some of the issues that come with it?
So I think the primary challenge is that African countries by far have not established the economic basis for regional integration. By and large, regional integration on the continent is still driven by political will, the interest and the understanding that coming together helps us in terms of our balance and bargaining with the international economy. But there are many challenges. For example, within the regional groupings themselves, SADC, for example, has still got a bit of progress to make in terms of implementing its free trade area, as well as deciding on a schedule for free trade on services, which has been a long ongoing battle. The other challenges are regarding infrastructure. So the continent isn't very well integrated, and the road networks and rail networks and other infrastructure that's necessary for trade is not up to scratch, and there's very little connection between the countries. So these are some of the primary challenges that have been holding us back. Also, the countries on the continent have very low incomes. So if you can compare the Tripartite Free Trade Area to ASEAN, for example, the Asian region consists of 10 countries. In terms of GDP income, it sits at about $2.4 trillion US. In comparison, the Tripartite Free Trade Area of 26 African countries consists about the exact same amount of people in terms of population, but the incomes are far less at 1.6 trillion. So its incomes, its infrastructure, as well as establishing that very important economic basis for regional integration.
You talk about that infrastructure and economic basis. I mean, in terms of investment from the three blocks, how much are we talking in terms of putting in the money to make sure that there are systems that are put in place and infrastructure actually gets improved?
So one of the big challenges holding us back in that area is that most governments don't have the money to invest, and they rely strongly on donor income. This is from anything from running institutions to even doing research on what are the prospects that exist. So for example, in SADC, we know that Mozambique has recently faced challenges with its public financial situation. Other countries as well, such as Angola and even South Africa, has been questioned around its use of public finances. So that's one of the biggest bottlenecks that has been holding countries back in terms of investment. But there are some commitments on the continent, such as the AU import tariff, which is a step in the right direction towards self-funded development on the continent. And the challenge with the donor financing is that for most people, they think it is donor funding or it is some sort of donation, but typically it is in the form of industrial policy on the part of the donor countries. So when they do make the donations for the financing, they expect you to use service providers from their countries. They expect you to implement the infrastructure with service providers from Europe, which is sort of which contradicts the real intention behind regional integration and investment.
So as it stands now, with the bloc signing the agreement, does it align with South Africa's policy on exports and trade?
So it does align because South Africa is trying to push much strongly to integrate the region and establish regional value chains. But the problem is that there are some internal contradictions in the country itself. So we have high unemployment. At the same time, regional integration requires South Africa to share its industrial capacity. What that means is we need to then let go of some of the things we produce locally and integrate the rest of the countries, our neighboring countries, into our value chains. But given the high unemployment, this sort of trade-off is a very difficult space to navigate. On the other end is the challenge that we also sit on multiple groupings. So, for example, in the Tripartite Free Trade Area, a lot of the countries are straddling between COMESA as well as SADC, and these are groupings that have had their own separate trajectories. SADC, for example, has established a free trade area and is moving strongly towards establish some basis, at least financially, for a common market or a monetary union, but it's still far off. So the challenge is that the policy space domestically doesn't really allow for the necessary trade-offs. At the same time, there is this sort of contradiction in that countries are members to multiple groupings and are not willing to let go of that because it serves a specific purpose for their national development.